everyone. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Cassie Fabio. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Curriculum and Research Manager at the Fair Election Center's Campus Vote Project. A couple housekeeping items. We are recording this, so make sure you're aware of that. And if you do need access to closed captioning, Zoom now offers that service at the bottom of your screen. So for those of you who aren't aware, I think most everyone on here does know this. Campus Vote Project works with universities, community colleges, faculty, students, and election officials to reduce barriers to student voting. Our goal is to help campuses institutionalize reforms that empower students with the information they need to register and vote. Sorry, gotta let people in as I'm going. Related to our conversation today, we co-sponsor the Ask Every Student initiative, which is a national joint initiative that facilitates collaboration between campus leaders and nonprofit partners to help campuses ask every student to participate in the democratic process and achieve full student voter registration. So today, I'm really excited to introduce to you the book 100% Democracy, The Case for Universal Voting. So in this book, 26 countries around the world require participation in elections, including Australia, which has required citizens to cast a ballot since 1924 and had over 90% voter turnout in its last major election. The US, on the other hand, lags behind other democracies, with only 66.8% of eligible voters participating in the record turnout election of 2020. So if Americans are required to pay taxes and serve on juries, why not ask or require every student to vote, or every American to vote? You can tell I talk about students most of the time. So our authors here today are EJ Dionne and Miles Rapoport. EJ is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, a syndicated columnist for the Washington Post, a university professor at my master's alma mater, Georgetown University, and a visiting professor at Harvard University. He's the author of Code Red, How Progressives and Moderates Can Unite to Save Our Country. And then Miles Rapoport is the Senior Practice Fellow in American Democracy at the Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation at the Harvard Kennedy School. He formerly served in the Connecticut State Legislature and as Connecticut Secretary of State. He also serves as president of Demos and of Common Cause. So I want to thank each of you so very much for being here today.
It's delightful to be here, and thank you and everybody on this call for everything they're doing for democracy. It's really important.
Indeed. Go ahead, Bob.
No, you go ahead.
So I'm going to turn it over to the president of the Fair Election Center, Bob Brandon, to say a few more words.
Okay, thanks. And thanks for that introduction, Cassie, for these two esteemed gentlemen who I've known for a while. And EJ also spent about 15 years, plus or minus, at the New York Times as a political reporter. He and I shared a lunch once to talk about the future of tax reform. I don't know if you remember that, the WIS Foundation.
I do.
And you know, it's
we
just
need to have that lunch again, I think, at this moment.
Right. And is really one of the smart and insightful commentators, and a true progressive, but one that really has sort of spread the wealth by teaching and writing, and now this book with another a much older and dear colleague, Miles Rapoport. We've worked together for many years. And I first met Miles when he was an organizer. And we helped start an organization together back in the late 70s. And since then he went on to run for state rep, which he won in Connecticut, was Secretary of State in Connecticut and sort of advanced a lot of progressive causes there. And then started Demos, really out of whole cloth, an organization some of you all, I think, know, and has done really some remarkable work over the years in not only democracy, but in the importance of dealing with debt and the economics of that face a lot of everyday people and low-income people in the country. And then went on to sort of really boost Common Cause in the middle of its career organizationally, done some really great work, and since has been causing trouble out of the Ash Center at Kennedy, the Kennedy School. I'm really waiting to hear. I missed their in-person book appearance in DC when they were here about a month ago, unfortunately. So I'm looking forward to hearing this. And I think this, the importance of this to me is this is a really important discussion to start having. Imagine if we actually had everybody voting and it wasn't about navigating this voter suppression rules in the country and, who gets the right information, but rather we start with the fact that everybody's going to be voting as part of their civic duty. It's quite an interesting discussion to start, and hopefully a campaign that we might one day achieve and be in a much better place with our democracy. So I'm going to turn it over to these guys.
All right,
Well, thank
TJ,
you.
I'm gonna let you start. You're always our leadoff hitter, but I really have to say, thanks to Cassie, but also a huge thanks to Bob Brandon. And the students hate to hear the old guys talking about how long they've known each other and what great work they did, but Bob really has been an anchor and a superstar of progressive organizing and progressive politics for over 50 years. So I have been honored to know him and work with him. So when he said, "Why don't we have you guys come and talk?" I leaped at the suggestion. So Bob, thank you very, very much.
Yeah, I want to thank Bob for his work, and Cassie as well, and all of you out there. And I always tell our kids that the one good thing about getting old is you have old friends. So that is one thing you look forward to. And there'll be probably people on this call you are friends with and do good stuff with over 40 years. And that's kind of cool. I'd still, if you give me the choice, I'd still rather be young, but it's a good consolation if you, since you can't stay young forever. And I also just want to salute my co-author, Miles. Miles, no matter what he is doing, he always organizes people. I've said that when Miles goes to heaven, he will quickly organize the angels into an angels union. And if Europe could only tap Miles's energy, he's got so much of it that they would never have to rely on another drop of Russian oil. So it's a real joy to work with Miles Rapoport. And Bob really summarized why we are in this, why we wrote this book really, really well, because that's exactly what we are trying to get people to do, to imagine what our democracy would look like if, as in Australia, which has had this system for 100 years, so you talk about proof of concept, 100 years, if that doesn't satisfy somebody, I don't know what will. In Australia, they've got 96% of their people registered because they make registration easy and the government helps carry it out, and 90% of them vote. And that would make a real difference in our democracy. I like to ask people to think about our election system as like a fancy dinner party. You know, those fancy dinner parties where they have A lists, the preferred people, and then the B list and C list if people on the A list don't come. That's what our election system is like, because we've got an A list of likely voters, the people who vote all the time, and a B list of people who are registered but don't vote, and a C list of the many, many Americans who aren't registered to vote at all. Politicians and their consultants and the campaigns spend almost all their time with the A-list people, the likely voters. They get the attention, they get the mail, they get asked again and again and again to vote. The people on the B list sometimes get a little attention, but not a whole lot. And the people on the C list are ignored entirely. This has a number of perverse effects. Number one, people tend to do things when they are asked. There's a great story about late House Speaker Tip O'Neill, who got reelected, as he always did, ran into an old friend who congratulated him. And Tip said, "I assume you voted for me." And the friend said, "Oh, no, I didn't." And according to the story, Tip said, "But you've known me all my life. Why didn't you vote for me?" And the person looked at Tip O'Neill and said, because you never asked. And there are a whole lot of people in our country, a whole lot of citizens who were just never asked to participate. So all the attention goes to those likely voters. And that means a number of things about our campaigns. Number one, that all this time is spent pulling out your own base. As Miles likes to say, campaigns are often about enrage to engage. And that can have negative effects on its own. But even worse, the likely voters for the other side are subject to a bombardment of negative information about their own candidate, either through direct voter suppression or just discouragement. All these folks are encouraged not to vote by our campaigns. So we built a kind of infernal machine that makes it less likely for people to vote. And I don't have to tell the young people on this call that our system really, really makes it hard on young people to vote. It's a system built for middle-aged and older people, because if you live in the same place for a period of time, your registration stays the same, you get all the notifications. If you're young, you move around a lot. Our system is terrible for people who move around a lot, and that's an awful lot of young people as a natural part of their own lives. So we think that our system, which would require everyone to vote, would have a second effect. And that's the other reason that Miles and I are doing this work. I got engaged partly because I got to know Australian politics very well over the years for a variety of reasons. I spent quite a bit of time down there, and I saw how this system worked. And I realized when I looked at voter suppression efforts, which are particularly intense right now, but they're not new in our history. We've been fighting them at various points in our history, going all the way back to the backlash against the enfranchisement of African Americans and Black Americans after the Civil War. And under this system, we argue in the book, and we think this is something we really want people to think about, that the best way to defend voting as a right is to declare it a legal and civic duty. Because as we argue in our book, if that happens, then all of our systems have to bend toward making it easier for everyone to vote. Our laws are shaped so that everyone can do their civic duty. That means, and we can get into this, a whole series of reforms that we started in the pandemic that rather than pulling back from, we need to push to their fruition to make it easy to vote. That's what Australia does. I had a great research assistant who was looking up all the ways in which the Australian system, from their great board elections commission, all the ways Australia makes it easy to vote and easy to register. And she came into my office very excitedly and said, you got to look at this website. They do all these cool things to help people vote. Why can't we do that? And that's our question. Why can't we do that? And so we'll talk more about how the system works. But we think that a democracy that includes all of us, it's kind of crowdsourcing. The more people you have in it, the better the answer is likely to be, the fairer the answer is likely to be, and the more inclusive the group of people will be who make the fundamental decisions about the future of our country.
Thanks, EJ. And I'll return the favor to EJ, who has been an incredible partner on this. He really got me into this, which is, I will tell that story momentarily, but he's, in addition to being just an incredible resource in politics and journalism for the country, he's a really wonderful human being. So it's been a labor of love to do this. By the way,
thank you, Miles.
Cassie, when I was in the legislature, we had a thing that was called a point of personal privilege, where a legislator could sort of go off script a little bit just to acknowledge somebody in the audience. So I just want to do a nice shout out to Ryan Pieranunzi, who I know is one of your leading staff people, but he was a student of, I shouldn't say a student of mine because I wasn't actually a teacher there, but we did a study group and he came a lot and he really exhibited incredible interest in all these issues. So I was delighted to connect him to Fair Election Center and glad to see it's still working out. So hi, Ryan, great to see you.
Thanks so much, Miles. Good to see you.
So here's the way I got to this, and I think it's important because it's a little bit different from what EJ was saying. So I have been as you pointed out, both Bob and Cassie, working on these issues of voting rights, democracy expansion, money in politics, for pretty close to 40 years, if you go all the way back to when I first got elected to the legislature. And I have worked on same-day voter registration and restoration of voting rights for people with felony convictions and pre-registration of 16 and 17-year-olds and expanded mail-in voting and expanded early voting and automatic voter registration at state agencies. There's a whole kind of suite, I would call it, of reforms. And I firmly believe in them. And I think that they have made a difference. So in 2018, we had a record turnout for midterms, which is at 50.3%. And in 2020, we had a record, depending on exactly how you count it, record turnout for a presidential election at 66.2. So I'm delighted that we, especially in the 2020 election, given the pandemic and all of the challenges that were taking place, including 400 lawsuits, thanks to the Fair Election Center for winning some of those, it's really nothing to write home about. So I started to say to myself, maybe a few years ago, what might I get involved in that would really move the needle in a huge way? And I ended up reading a piece that E.J. Dionne and his colleague at the Brookings Institution, William Galston, wrote, basically making the case for why the Australian system of mandatory participation at the polls, not compulsory voting, and we can say why it's not really that. And I thought two things. One, this is a really, really intriguing idea. And as EJ said, it has proof of concept for 100 years in Australia, which nobody thinks is a totalitarian country as a result. And the second thing was, how is it that I've been doing this work for almost 40 years and I've never, ever once been in a discussion of this issue? And so when EJ and I were talking at Harvard one day, I proposed to him that we do a working group. And which came about as a joint project of the Ash Center and the Brookings Institution, which he and I co-chaired. It was 28 really, really smart, really fabulous people, scholars, lawyers, election advocates, public officials, et cetera. And we came out with a report in 2020 called Lift Every Voice, the Urgency of Universal Civic Duty Voting. And it got some attention. And one of the places where it got attention was the publisher of the New Press, a woman named Diane Martell. And the New Press is a great independent nonprofit publishing house, who said, I've been wanting somebody to write a book about universal voting for years. Would you be willing to do it? And I said, yes, but I would really, really like to do it jointly with E.J. Dionne if he'll do it with me. And she said, twist my bleeping arm. So EJ and I set out to do this together. We wrote it about a year ago, building on the report that we did and all the work that was done. And we've really, our goal is, and I'll wrap up with this, our goal is to really start a discussion on this issue that has never been discussed. And we think that there's a value to doing that, not supplanting all the work that's going on to fight back against voter suppression, to do the lawsuits to make sure that people have expanded options to vote, et cetera. I mean, there's a huge amount of day-to-day fights that we need to do, but we wanted to put kind of a North Star reform out there to say, imagine what we might do if we really got to a point where everybody was participating. And again, not to emphasize the kind of the penalties or the fines, et cetera, because that's not really the central focus of what happens in Australia or the other countries, the other 26 countries where they have this. It's to build a culture of full participation and expectation. And I think we can do that. And it would be a really, really important thing if we could.
Miles, you mentioned this, but I would love for you to explain it a little bit more, especially for our students who maybe haven't had a chance to read since they are in the midst of their finals. What would you say is the difference between mandatory and compulsory voting? In
the legal work that we did with a terrific group of lawyers, there is, a lot of case law that says you cannot compel speech. You can't force people to say the Pledge of Allegiance. You can't force people to do this, but you can compel conduct. So the best analogy in my mind has always been jury duty. So we, ask everybody, we require everyone to serve on juries if they're called. And the reason that we do that is so that we have a jury pool writ large that is fully reflective of the population as a whole. Obviously, jury systems don't always achieve that goal in day-to-day practice, but that's the idea. And we think that the same principle really applies to voting, which is we want, or we should want, the fullest participation of everyone in making the decisions that affect our lives. And the nuance of that, I will actually let EJ explain, because he's been talking about it a lot as we've gone along.
Yeah, thank you. It is. I'm really glad you asked. Richard Nixon, when he was president, whenever he didn't like a question, he'd say, "I'm glad you asked that question." But in this case, I really am glad you asked that question, because it is an important point in our argument. As Miles said, it's an important point legally, but it's also an important point morally. We don't think we can tell anybody, or the state can tell somebody. They have to participate, and they must vote for the candidates on this piece of paper. And so the way the Australians set up the system is the way we would, which is you would be perfectly free to cast a blank ballot. You could write in, she's on our screen, so you could write in Rebecca Carruthers or Armand or Susan or anybody you wanted. You could scrawl a message across the ballot. You could do anything you want with the ballot, and you would have to pick no one. But you have to participate. You have to join the electoral process. So abstention is a statement as well. But just to be 100% clear about this, we would add to the ballot what they already have in Nevada and Arizona, which is a none of the above option. So if you really, really, really want to make clear you don't like any of these folks, you could check none of the above. We think that's right on legal grounds, but we also think that's right on moral grounds. And so we don't like to use the term compulsory voting, but we do like to use the word universal voting or civic duty voting, because the net result of this system would be to pull almost everybody in. And if I could, Cassie, let me just say a word about the mechanics so people understand what we're proposing and how it works in Australia, and Miles can jump on this. Under the Australian system, which is similar to that in about 24 other democratic countries, in Australia, if you don't vote, you get a little notice from the government, and it asks you, you noticed you didn't vote, can you explain why? If you give any sort of reasonable excuse, they let you out of the fine. I was sick, my child was sick. They're quite broad in letting people off on the fine. If you don't want to do that and just say, no, I didn't vote, the fine is $20 Australian, which is roughly $15 American. We would do the same thing under our system. We view this as a nudge, not a hammer, not a shove. The fine would be that we propose, and obviously states and the federal government will enact this in some form, but we felt an obligation to lay out a proposal in detail. The fine would be no more than $20. We've worried very much about what has come to be called the Ferguson problem, low-income people who have fine after fine piled on top of them, interest and penalties get accumulated, the fines get criminalized. We don't want any of that to happen with this. And so what we propose is there'd be nothing criminal about this fine. It would be a flat $20, and so you would pay no more than that. We would also give people the option of paying it off with an hour of community service. And a lot of people ask us, well, you're doing the compulsory thing, why don't you do incentives? And we are very interested in an idea which we talk about favorably in the book, of a tax credit for everyone who registers to vote, a refundable tax credit. So it goes to poor people as well as people who pay income taxes. $50, $100. Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley has been interested in this idea. If you did that combined with our system, people wouldn't even be the $20 would effectively come out of the credit they've already gotten. So it's almost like a fine for not completing the job. So you give back some of the $50. Again, we're not trying to penalize people. We are trying to create this cultural participation. One last point. In Australia, which has early voting and all kinds of other ways you can vote, they hold elections on a Saturday. We're not tied to Saturday ourselves. We think it should be a holiday, but we can pick a day to make it a holiday. But on election day in Australia, elections really are like parties. We quote a voter saying that because everybody's in every polling place, and they have a lot of them, so people don't wait forever to vote. We also suggest in the book, in line with President Obama's commission, no one who actually goes to vote in person should ever have to wait more than a half an hour to vote. And that means we should have more polling places, support our election system better. But civic groups and school groups of every kind set up all kinds of, you can buy food to eat, all kinds of great food, giving the money to some civic group. And Australians are known for democracy sausages. At every polling place, somebody is selling a democracy sausage. The election board in Australia has a sense of humor, and they actually put out a directive that said the proper place for the onion on the democracy sausage is on top. Two things about that. One, in our book, we also suggest that vegan alternatives be offered to democracy sausages. And so if we had the kind of celebration they have in Australia, I like to say that the only bad thing about our system is people might gain some weight on election day. But we think that's okay if it advances democracy.
And we have a question in the chat asking how this would potentially be funded.
Yeah, let me take that one. So, and I think it's a really, really good question. So, the United States is sort of like unique in a bad way in having an election system that is completely balkanized. It is partisan, with generally speaking, secretaries of state or others, who are running, adjudicating the elections. And I was one, so I know it's not a good system. But it
was brilliant when you were Secretary of the State.
Yeah, I did my best.
By the way, can I tell everybody something I learned writing this book that I would never have known, which is Connecticut is the only state in the union where the title is not Secretary of State, it's Secretary of the State. So I always thought as the person, Miles wrote over all the other secretaries of state in the country. Anyway, go ahead, Miles.
That's right. That's right. Anyway, so it's too partisan. It's too balkanized. We have, kind of county systems and local systems and different state systems, et cetera. So all of that. And it is vastly underfunded. During 2020, the Brennan Center estimated that $4 billion was needed to kind of make all the adjustments that would make it possible to vote. Congress appropriated $400 million, which was 10% of what was needed, promising that the rest of it would be forthcoming. And it never came. I am excited to say that in President Biden's budget, which is yet to pass, but hopefully, it will, there is $10 billion set aside for election administration to modernize voting, to, do the computerization, to have more election officials, to pay them better, a lot of things. So I think that that's a really, really important point that needs to be said. But actually, let me generalize it just a little bit, which is that we realize that it'd be very hard and very difficult, excuse me, to impose a universal voting system in a state, let's say, that had a voter suppression regime. You know what I mean? In other words, how can you tell people that they have to vote when the government is making it really difficult for them? And the answer is you really can't. So what we support is a whole series of reforms that we call gateway reforms, in addition to funding and good election administration. But some of the issues that I said before, with opening up registration options and opening up voting options, et cetera. So I think that all that is really important in order to make universal voting genuinely successful. But we think if we do that, especially in some states where they already have good levels of participation and good procedures, I think there's a real chance to do this. And we want to put it out there kind of as a North Star reform. Again, not in place of what everybody is doing, but, thinking about imagining a future where we have genuinely full participation.
So EJ, I want to go back to something that you said at the beginning, which is talking about young people. We're basically like the B list, right? Where people, we haven't registered yet because we just had, I'm not considered a young voter anymore, but I used to be like 2 years ago. And so one of the things I'm thinking about is we have reforms, right? Or recommendations like the Higher Education Act, or this really recent Dear Colleagues letter to the Department of Education that come out, but they don't really have teeth. So in what ways can we maybe work on institutionalizing 100% democracy within institutions of higher education? And maybe like a second part to this is sometimes, at least in my experience, those places of higher education are maybe not super excited about that idea, but the students are. So in what ways might students be able to galvanize their own campuses to work more toward 100% democracy?
Yeah, two things just prior to what you're talking about. One of the reforms that Miles and I feel strongly about is election day registration, because a lot of times you're in a new place and you only sort of discover, oh, there is an election here. In other words, if it's not a presidential election, I really want to vote. And then you discover that the registration is shut already. With election day registration, you can just show up and register. You need some kind of proof, but that increases turnout in a very big way. Miles, you had the numbers on that once upon a time. I've forgotten what the percentage is, but it really,
it's 5 to 7% increase for election day registration, and that holds whether it's battleground or not battleground. We're kind of adjusting for all the other variables. So it's a pretty good, important reform for sure.
And I think that's particularly good for young people. There are a lot of universities around the country who have who are part of a compact where they are encouraging students to vote, and where when you register as a student, when you get your opening materials, options to register are there. I know at some universities, they've created portals so you can access registration either in the state that you are in, or as a student, or back home where you came from, and you can link into voter registration, online voter registration opportunities there. You can, I think students also can be very effective in telling each other, giving each other word about deadlines for various things. That's one of the things I suspect you guys do quite a bit of. As for a recalcitrant administration, I'm curious if you run into a lot of those, because in my experience, universities have been pretty good about wanting to encourage their students to vote. Somewhere in my closet, I have a Notre Dame Votes t-shirt, because I did a little teaching at Notre Dame years ago and met all these great students who were trying to get everybody registered to vote. I know a lot of schools in New England do this. I think sometimes the local politicians in an area often don't want this great mass of new students in. New Hampshire passed a law, which I think was thrown out by a court, that really made it hard for students at universities there to vote in the towns where the university was. And I think litigation of that sort against laws like that are important. I'm just curious what kind of barriers you run up against.
Yeah, I'm smiling because we're not just preaching to the choir with that, EJ. We are lecturing to the professors. I mean,
yeah, right, exactly. That's well said, Miles. That's why I ended with a question.
Before I
thirst for knowledge.
Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
No, I just said I thirst for knowledge. So please go ahead.
I mean, I have personally lots of examples as a person who currently lives in Texas, but I would love to see if any of our students who are on have an example that they would like to share before I share my own example. They may not. I think we have mostly decentish states on right now.
So by the way, I'd love to hear from Eugenia, because the E stands for Eugene. And so it's fun to see another one of us on here.
I love that for us, literally so much. I never met other Eugenes or Eugenias, so this is exciting for me.
I had a writer for the Washington Post called Eugene Scott with my students. I said I had him because he's brilliant, but I also had him because this will be the only classroom at Georgetown where there are two Eugenes teaching students. So.
So, and Eugenia, I know you don't face it as much on your campus. So Eugenia is actually my intern, and she is out Southwestern, which is a private university. But one of the things I found is that public universities, especially in states where like their chancellor or is chosen by the Board of Regents, who is chosen by the governor in our case, are very hesitant to touch getting students out to vote. While I've seen, and I can say from our example at UT Austin, we were incredibly successful as students doing our own organizing, but getting anyone beyond someone with like student activities to care deeply about what we were doing was nearly impossible and sometimes not advantageous because they might just shut us down. And I think that might happen to other public universities in states similar to Texas, where they're not super excited about young people voting.
Yeah, it's clearly a problem.
Yeah.
So I want to answer, can I answer one of the questions that's from Ryan about, can states do this on their own? Or
Absolutely.
unless
Yeah,
Bob, did you want to say something about the other issue? Okay. So we're assuming, have been working on the assumption that where universal voting will get traction is either in states or even in municipalities. States absolutely have the right to set the terms and conditions of voting, for not only for the state elections, but for congressional elections as well. They can pass legislation that initiates this. So we're assuming that. Actually, we're going next week to Minneapolis and St. Paul. We have a series of meetings with both election officials and advocates there. And I think Minnesota might be a place that we might make a little progress, as well as some other places. But I must now, municipalities, I think, could be really, really interested, and especially it is trickier because, technically speaking, constitutionally speaking, municipalities are creatures of the state. And so in most states, it varies from state to state. Some states give their municipalities a lot of leeway, some states don't. But you would probably need, enabling legislation of some sort. However, to our surprise, and this goes to the point EJ made earlier about Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley and being interested in this issue. 2 weeks ago, we did an event at the Old State House in Connecticut. And actually it was in the room where the trial of Joseph Cinque, the leader of the Amistad Revolt in 1839, took place. So this was a really historic venue. But Congressman John Larson actually came, brought a copy of the book. He had seen us on Morning Joe, and decided that he really wanted to submit legislation. So there is now a federal bill. It is called the Civic Duty to Vote Act, HR 7536, sponsored by Congressman John Larson and also co-sponsored by Congressman Joe Courtney, and they're working on getting other co-sponsors. So it's interesting, we feel really good. I mean, obviously it's not going to pass. Congress couldn't even pass the John Lewis, Voting Rights Advancement Act or the Freedom to Vote Act, or probably anything else at this point. But the fact that it's there, kind of moves the discussion forward. So we're happy to see it. So the answer to Ryan's question is, this could happen at either federal level, state level, or municipal level. And our plan going forward after we take a couple of weeks and relax our throats from our frenetic tour here, is to develop an organizing plan, the 100% Democracy Initiative, which will, reach out and start to organize in various states to see if we can put this on the agenda. So nothing happens, as Bob well knows, and all of you know, nothing happens without organizing. So that's the next step in this journey.
Could I say two quick things? One is the book contains a copy of a model for the bill. it was introduced in the Connecticut state legislature by State Senator Will Haskell, and who got elected at age 22. And I'm particularly proud of that because Will Haskell was my student, one of my students, and came into my office one day and said, by the way, he hadn't graduated yet, and said, by the way, I am running for the state Senate back in Connecticut. And he laid out his plan of how somebody who hadn't even graduated from college yet was going to get elected to the state Senate. And by gosh, he did. And he introduced this bill. Just on your point, Cassie, I'm curious, as soon as you and Miles said what you said, of course, at a lot of public universities, in particularly in red states, there are going to be a lot of people not wanting this to happen. I'd be curious if there are kind of large national groups like Campus Compact and other organizations. I'd be very curious if the private universities, say in Texas, might create a back door to this, to create alliances among universities, so that it's not just the public university out there, it's all these other universities are doing this for their students, and the students can plausibly ask, why not us? And it would raise some levels of conflict, but it might be worth doing. Anyway, it's just a thought, because I appreciate that you want to do that.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. One of the ways that we've seen success with our voter-friendly campus designation program, which is asking our campuses to put together their civic engagement plans for any given election cycle. Oftentimes, once you get into the state and have a couple campuses on board, it definitely rolls a little bit easier. And oftentimes, in a state like mine, it's a little easier to go to like a Texas Women's or a Southwestern University, which are both private first. Or sometimes there are backdoors. People like me have figured out how to get through the burnt orange tape in some ways, but it's definitely not quite codified in the same way as other groups would like to see real institutionalization happening on campuses. It's more like very successful student organizations doing their own thing. We have about 15 minutes left. So I want to be sure if our audience has any questions. I've tried to keep an eye on the chat, but are there other questions that y'all might have that you'd like to ask, or I have questions lined up too?
Do you see Rick's question on there, Miles? I like that question. That's at the top of my chat.
Rick Battistoni. Yep.
I missed that one. So it says, I completely support this proposal, but how do we convince partisan public officials who don't see it in their interest to go beyond the A list and mobilizing citizens?
Miles, why don't you start, since you got bills through the legislature, sometimes with great struggle.
Right. Look, this is clearly, we're not naive. This is clearly an uphill climb. It will certainly be an uphill climb, in states where the culture is not one of encouraging people to vote, but one of discouraging people to vote. On the other hand, I think you can make a case that this is not a kind of a partisan proposal. It turns out that in 2020, while Joe Biden was winning by 7 million votes, the Republicans picked up a number of congressional seats. And one of the reasons that they did so is because it was easier for people in rural states or in rural portions of states to vote, and they tended to be Trump voters. And so, this does not always help. And the other obvious example is Virginia, where the Democrats were in control, passed a lot of really, really good voting expansions. And then in the 2021 elections, the Republicans proceeded to sweep the table, electing a governor and all the other constitutional offices and turning the House of Representatives from blue to red. So I think we can make a case that that we are not proposing this as a trick for partisan officials, that we want this for everyone, and we think that it can benefit everyone. It is true, by the way, I will say that, often current elected officials will say, well, how does this benefit me? I've done just fine in the system that we have, whether that's the money in politics system or whether that's the electoral college system or whatever it is. But there are election officials and elected officials who I think really want to see the system work better. So, and state legislators. So we're going to try to find them work with them and see if we can move things forward, both at the grassroots level, but also with some supportive legislators.
Yeah, very briefly, just to add to that, with pressure, and sometimes out of, because they are civic minded, legislatures can move even when it's not, even if they like the electorate as it is, just fine because it elected them. One of the things we did, I joke that this proves that Miles and I are either the two most honest book writers in the world or two of the dumbest book writers in the world, because we have polling in the book that shows that right now the vast majority of people are not for our idea. Right now 26% support our idea. Most of the rest, 10%, are undecided, the rest oppose it, although only about 48% are strongly opposed to it. So a couple of things about that. When I saw those numbers, I wasn't disappointed, because we're pushing a brand new idea that no one's ever made a case for. And when you see 50% of the people at least not strongly opposed, thus open to persuasion, we think that's not a terrible place to start with an idea like this. Secondly, what we found, and this was in February of 2020, so that's before Donald Trump kind of poisoned this issue more than it already was in the campaign. But Republicans were almost as likely as Democrats to support this. And the other thing is that a substantial majority, 61%, agreed with the proposition that voting is both a right and a duty. And those numbers were equal among Republicans and Democrats. So again, we know there's a lot of work to do. We know under the current environment, a big faction in the Republican Party is trying to make voting harder. But as Miles likes to say, if you look at the election conduct during 2020, there were quite a number of Republican election officials and secretaries of state who actually did make it easier for people to vote. And right now, it tends to be in states that are, well, just a fact. Since the 2020 election, 25 states have tried to make it easier for people to vote, build on the reforms. 19 states, this is according to the Brennan Center, have moved backward, trying to make it harder to vote. But there are interesting things happening in some red states, Utah, Kentucky. What was the other one, Miles, we were talking
Actually,
about?
South Carolina.
And
Surprised
South
everybody
Carolina.
recently by expanding the early voting.
And they passed in a bipartisan way. Now, it could be one party feels so secure that they're willing to do that, but that's not nothing. And so it's encouraging that while we face these fights, and we got to be honest about facing these fights, and there may be some openings here.
I just want to say really quickly that we have gotten, we put this idea out, through the book and through our own kind of energy and organizing work. And we've gotten two different kinds of responses, neither of which were kind of not expected, both of which were expected in a way. So there's some people who say, what are you guys, crazy? I mean, we're having such a hard time just preserving the democracy that we have, as imperfect as it is, against the assaults on democracy coming from the MAGA faction and from the, not all Republicans, but a bulk of the Republican Party. But the second reaction is, wow, this is a really interesting idea. I never thought about it. And I would say that we are getting, we haven't gone to the we haven't gone to the CPAC convention to present this idea, but in various.
There's a thought, Miles. That would be kind of fun. With Bob, you got to come as our bodyguard, and maybe, maybe Rick and Ryan. But go ahead.
Anyway, but I would say that in a lot of different places, what we're getting is, this is really interesting. This is worthy of discussion. I hadn't heard about it. I'm going to read the book. I really like the book. I'm going to assign it to my students, so I think we're pleased with the reaction that we're getting.
So I think I will turn it over for one last question before we wrap up here. Does anyone have a question you'd like to ask?
Can I call on my namesake?
Eugenia, do you have a question?
Um,
Any question, go for it.
I'm racking my brains. Okay, I think I'm interested if maybe could you give us like some talking points, right? If we have to sell the idea of universal democracy to like our classmates and maybe, like relatives and all those awkward political conversations at the Thanksgiving dinner table, right? Like how should we handle that?
That's a
What would you say?
great question. You want to start, Miles?
Sure. I mean,
Thank you.
On the one hand, I think that that you can point to a set of advantages. And again, if people, I should tell it, I should say, if people are completely closed-minded about it, we're not going to convince them. But assuming that people are at least a little bit open, then I think there are, I'll say, 4 really quick advantages to what the system is. One, it would boost turnout immediately. In the Australia case, they went from 60% voting to 90% voting in the very first election, and they have stayed there for 100 years. Secondly, the voting electorate would be far more representative of the population as a whole. In fact, it would be the population as a whole. And so right now, as you well know, young voters are underrepresented, poor voters are represented, communities of color are less represented, and government responds to people who vote, and people, not to mention people who give money. So I think you would see a difference in how the government responded people. Third thing is, as EJ said, I think all of the institutions of our country would bend themselves towards doing this. So if I were, I'll just use one example. If I were the principal of a high school and I knew that all of my students were going to be required to vote, would I make civic education a more important part of the curriculum? I think I would, and I think that goes for civic organizations and employers and, lots of other places. And then the last thing is that I think campaigns would really, really benefit. I mean, right now, campaigns are all about turning out people who agree with you. There's very little persuasion going on. In fact, the Democratic consultants, and I'm sure the Republican consultants, are busy saying, this is a turnout election. Don't waste time trying to persuade people. If we can get the people who came out in 2018 to vote again, we'll win. But it's not really and obviously the flip side of that is trying to suppress or depress the vote of your opponent. But if you have to talk to everybody and everybody's going to vote and everybody is listening, I think that will really make campaigns much, much healthier if we did that. So those are 4 advantages that I think I would argue to people who are at least open to the discussion. We're in the 50% that are open to the discussion.
Yeah, a couple of other points. One is there's evidence that this does a couple of things. It probably makes the electorate somewhat more moderate. We quote an Australian former retired politician who's now the governor of Western Australia. He said, the kinds of people brought into this electorate by what they have, compulsory attendance at the polls, would not go for those QAnon nuts, he said. And I know a Republican political consultant who's privately for this. I'm trying to get him to come out and support it because he thinks it would create a more moderately conservative Republican Party. It would pull the party away from extremism. And I still think there are people who, there are a lot of people outside the Republican Party who want that to happen, but I think there are Republicans who want that too. The other point I would make that I always like to talk about is we all take for granted that we have a secret ballot. We cast our ballot privately. No one knows who we voted for unless we want to tell them. We didn't used to have the secret ballot. That was a reform. It was actually a reform that came from Australia. When the secret ballot was adopted, it was known as the Australian ballot. And the great historian Jill Lepore, by the way, wrote a great piece about this in the New Yorker. We've got a footnote in the book to her. This was really controversial. People used to go and cast a ballot in public. It was printed by your political party or a political newspaper, and you'd bring it, and everybody knew how you voted. And people resisted this, and it took about 20 years of struggle from I think the late 1880s till the beginning of the 20th century. Now people would say, well, of course we have a secret ballot. How else would you vote? But this was a radical idea. And I like to say, you know, the United States can be pretty good about borrowing good ideas from other people. And the Australians seem to be pretty good at thinking up good ideas about elections. We took the secret ballot from them, and now we say, well, did we ever do it otherwise? We like to think this idea, when it's adopted, they don't think it's radical in Australia. They think it's part of day-to-day life. And we would like politics to be something that people don't just feel obligated to do, although we underscore their civic obligation, but something that they expect to participate in. And because it becomes part of their life, they become engaged. Last point, my favorite picture about how this works in Australia: 4 surfers in wetsuits near Bondi Beach in Sydney, Australia. Their surfboards leaning up against the booth, casting their ballots. That's how deep it goes as you know, what civic duty voting means. I'm sure they jump right back into the surf. I think we can have the same kind of sort of joy in participation and more election parties. And last point, political science has shown that election day associated with parties, you have higher turnout. So let's party a lot more on election day.
We love that idea. We encourage our students to do that here. I get to have dinner with my very good Australian friend in like 2 weeks. So now I'm just going to pick his brain for more democracy ideas we can steal from them.
Yeah.
I want to take this opportunity to thank you both for spending time with us tonight. We will have a recording of this for any fellows who weren't able to come. It will be part of our Monday email next week. But seriously, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for sharing your book. Thank you for sharing your knowledge. It's exciting to me to see that. I think we'll have generations of students really and people thinking really critically about this idea. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you all for showing up. I really, really appreciate it, and for what you do every day.
Hey, I was going to say that. Thanks for the work that you do to protect and improve democracy. So great to be in this with all of you.
Bob, do you
Thanks,
have any?
EJ and Miles.
Thank you. Have a good night, everybody.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks. Bye-bye.